My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and 19 days before my younger sister's wedding, my parents sent me an email with 4 conditions attached, like a contract I hadn't agreed to negotiate. Condition 1: sign a non-disclosure agreement about, quote, past family incidents, specifically anything related to the bakery fire 12 years ago. Condition 2: formally relinquish my remaining 10% stake in Bennett & Cabo, the rebuilt family bakery, transferring it to my sister Grace. Condition 3: contribute $15,000 toward the wedding to, quote, make up for years of financial distance. Condition 4: stand up at the rehearsal dinner and apologize publicly for, quote, the strain I caused this family. At the bottom, in my father's clipped handwriting scanned into the PDF, was one line: complete all 4 and you're welcome at the ceremony. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time slower because something about the wording bothered me before I could name what it was. They weren't asking me to make peace. They were asking me to sign away the truth before I ever had the chance to say it out loud. I want to tell you exactly what happened after that email because by the end of this story you're going to understand why one photograph printed on ordinary paper kept in a shoebox for 12 years, was enough to stop a 300-guest wedding in its tracks. But first, tell me something. What time is it where you are right now? Are you driving home from work or lying in bed with the lights off? I always wonder how far these stories travel and who's listening when they do. Here's what you need to know about my family before I go further. We owned a bakery, not a chain, not a franchise, a single storefront in a small Ohio town called Millbrook, founded by my grandfather in 1968. Bennett's Bakery was the kind of place where the smell of cinnamon rolls hit you from the sidewalk, where regulars had a usual. The staff didn't need written down where my father worked the register every Saturday morning, even after he could afford not to. When I was 17, that bakery burned to the ground. Nobody died. That's the first thing I always say because people assume worse. But the building did not survive, and neither did my place in this family, not after that night. For 12 years, I was the girl who left the back oven running. That's the story everyone told at Thanksgiving, at reunions, in the quiet asides relatives made when they thought I couldn't hear. Claire got distracted. Claire was careless. Claire cost this family everything they'd built. I never argued because at 17 I didn't have proof of what actually happened. I had a memory, and memories aren't admissible in the court of family opinion. My younger sister Grace was 15 that night. She'd been dating a boy named Tyler Voss, a relationship my parents didn't know about because Tyler was 20 and worked construction, and my mother would have ended it in a sentence. Grace used to sneak out through the bakery's back office to meet him near the loading dock, where there happened to be a fire pit the crew used for scrap wood. I know this because I saw them. Once. Through the office window on the night everything changed. I never got the chance to say so. By the time the fire trucks left, my parents had already decided what happened, and Grace had already decided to let them. 12 years later, she was engaged to a man named Marcus Doyle, a hospital administrator with a kind face and an unshakable belief that his fiancée was, in his words, the most honest person he'd ever met. And I was staring at an email demanding I erase the one thing that could correct the record permanently in writing before I'd even been invited to sit in the audience. I typed 4 words back: I decline all 4. Then I closed my laptop, opened a new tab, and booked a beach house in Cabo San Lucas for the wedding weekend. And then I made one more call to a print shop about a photograph I hadn't looked at in over a decade. To understand why my parents thought 4 conditions would be enough to buy my silence, you have to understand what kind of daughter Grace had always been to them and what kind of daughter I had always been by comparison. Grace was easy to love in public. She remembered birthdays without being reminded, complimented people's shoes, cried at the right moments in movies. She had what my mother called a gift for people. And it was real, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Grace could walk into a room of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and a dinner invitation. What she also had underneath that gift was a talent for making sure other people carried the weight of her choices. It started small, the way these things usually do. In college, she borrowed my car for a semester because hers was, quote, in the shop, and returned it with 11,000 new miles and a check engine light that cost me $400 to fix. When she lost her marketing job after 8 months, a job I had personally recommended her for, I spent 3 weekends helping her rebuild a resume and quietly covered her share of the apartment lease for 2 months so she wouldn't have to explain the gap to our parents. When she decided to open an event planning company, Bloom & Co. Events, I introduced her to 4 clients from the accounting firm where I worked. 2 of them are still her clients today. She never once mentioned my name when she talked about how the business got started. None of that ever bothered me as much as it probably should have because I told myself that's what sisters do. We help each other. What I didn't notice not until much later was that the help only ever moved in one direction. My grandmother, the same grandmother who founded the bakery's original recipe book, the same woman who taught both of us to laminate dough before we were tall enough to see over the counter, left something specific in her will. She left the rebuilt bakery, Bennett & Company, in equal 90-10 split between my father as majority owner with Grace and me, each holding a small minority stake structured so that neither of us could sell, transfer, or leverage our share without written consent from the other. She did that on purpose. My grandmother saw the imbalance between Grace and me decades before I did. She told me once, not long before she passed, "That girl loves easily and pays for nothing. Someone in this family needs to hold the receipts." I didn't understand what she meant until the receipts actually arrived. 6 months before the wedding, I was reviewing the bakery's quarterly books, something I still did as a courtesy since I'd kept my accounting license current, and nobody else in the family had the patience for it, and I found a business loan listed against Bennett & Company that I had never approved, never signed, and never even heard discussed. The loan was for $38,000. The lender's notes described it as wedding and business expansion, co-signed by C. Bennett. I had never signed anything. When I brought it up to Grace over the phone, she laughed it off the way she'd laughed off 100 smaller things before. "It's basically nothing," she said. "I needed a bridge loan for the venue deposit and some equipment for Bloom & Co. I'll pay it back before anyone notices." "Someone already noticed," I said. "Me." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me she was recalculating rather than apologizing. "You have money sitting in that stake doing nothing, Claire. I needed you to act like family for once." I asked her what C. Bennett meant on a signature line if it wasn't me. She didn't answer that question. Not then. I need to go back further because the loan wasn't really the beginning. The beginning was 12 years earlier on a Tuesday night in October when I was 17, and closing up the bakery alone because my father had a dentist appointment and my mother was at a school board meeting. Grace was supposed to be doing homework upstairs in the apartment above the shop where our family lived at the time. Instead, I heard the back door to the storage office open around 9:40 p.m., and when I went to check, I saw her through the small window in the office door, standing near the loading dock with Tyler Voss, a lit cigarette between his fingers close enough to the scrap wood fire pit that the ash from his cigarette could have landed anywhere. I didn't say anything that night. I was 17, embarrassed for both of us, and I figured I'd talk to her about it in the morning, tell her she was being reckless, maybe threaten to tell Mom if she didn't stop sneaking out. There was no morning conversation. By 11:15 p.m., smoke alarms were going off through the whole building. The fire marshal's report filed weeks later listed the likely point of origin as combustible materials near the rear loading dock cause undetermined possible careless disposal of smoking materials. My father never read past undetermined. What he remembered, what he chose to remember, was that I was the one who'd been working the closing shift and that the back office, my usual station, was closest to where the fire started. I told him I thought I smelled smoke near the loading dock earlier, that maybe someone had left something burning back there. I was too scared and too young to say Grace's name out loud, because saying it meant admitting I'd known she was sneaking out with a boy my parents had explicitly forbidden, and some small, foolish part of me was still trying to protect her the way older sisters do. Grace said nothing at all. She let the silence do the work for her. My father spent the next several years telling anyone who asked that the fire started, because I'd been careless with the oven's a version of events that was never technically stated in any official report, but was repeated so often in our family that it became fact by sheer volume. My mother stopped introducing me at church functions as our daughter the accountant, and started introducing me when she introduced me at all as our older one. I left for college 18 months later and didn't come home for 3 Christmases straight. Grace, in the meantime, became the daughter who held the family together during the rebuild, the daughter who helped design the new storefront, the daughter whose photo hung by the register next to my grandfather's. What almost nobody in my family knew, what I only learned myself 2 years after the fire, was that a security camera mounted above the loading dock installed by my father after a break-in the previous spring had been recording that night. The footage was grainy, low resolution, technically still usable as evidence, and it had captured roughly 4 seconds of Grace and Tyler standing near the fire pit, his cigarette clearly lit, time-stamped at 9:43 p.m., 17 minutes before the smoke alarms went off. My father never checked the camera. In the chaos of the fire and the insurance claim that followed, nobody thought to. I only found out it existed because Tyler Voss, feeling guilty years later, after he and Grace had long since broken up, mailed me a printed still frame from that footage, along with a handwritten note. "I think you should have this. I'm sorry I never said anything back then." I kept that photograph in a shoebox in my closet for a decade. I never showed it to my parents. I told myself I was protecting Grace the same way I had at 17. Looking back now, I think I was protecting the version of my family I still wanted to believe in, the version where nobody would do something like that to me on purpose. The 4 conditions in that email changed my mind about which version of my family was real. Once I saw the forged signature on that loan document, I stopped assuming anything and started documenting everything the same way I would for any client at the firm suspected of financial misconduct. I requested the complete loan file from the lender, a regional bank that had handled Bennett & Co.'s accounts for years. The loan officer, a woman named Patricia Reyes, was initially hesitant to release details, citing privacy concerns, until I explained I was a named co-signer disputing an unauthorized signature. That changed the conversation quickly. The electronic signature on file had been submitted from an IP address registered to Bloom & Co. Events, Grace's own office network. The identity verification questions, the ones designed to confirm you are who you claim to be, had been answered correctly using information that only close family would know: my first employer's name, the street we grew up on, our grandmother's maiden name. There was one more detail buried in the verification log. The system had also received an uploaded scan of my driver's license as secondary confirmation. I hadn't given anyone a copy of my license in over a year, except for one occasion the previous spring, when my mother told me our family insurance agent needed updated identification on file for a homeowner's policy review. When I called my mother and asked directly whether she'd forwarded that copy to anyone else, she said, "Of course not, why would I do that?" in a tone that answered the question more honestly than her words did. I didn't confront Grace again right away. Instead, my friend Marisol, an attorney I'd known since our college internship days, the only person I called before I called anyone else, told me something I've thought about ever since. She asked, "Do you want Grace to understand what she did, or do you want to be protected from what she might do next?" I said both. Marisol said, "You might have to choose the order. Protection comes first." That night, I placed a fraud alert on my credit report, requested written confirmation from the lender that my signature was formally disputed, and asked Marisol to draft a preservation notice, a legal letter, instructing my parents and Grace to retain, not destroy, any documents related to the loan, the wedding financing, and the bakery's ownership structure. Then I turned to the ledger itself because the $38,000 had to have gone somewhere, and I wanted to know exactly where. $11,000 had been transferred directly to Bloom & Co. Events, listed internally as operational reserve. $14,000 had gone to a venue deposit for the wedding itself, a converted vineyard estate outside Millbrook called Copper Hollow Farms. $9,000 had been paid to a vendor listed as Doyle Medical Consulting, a business connected to Marcus's side of the family, which struck me as strange until I realized it was likely a loan Grace intended to quietly repay before Marcus ever noticed the money had passed through Bennett & Company at all. The remaining $4,000 had disappeared into administrative fees and an overdue equipment lease. What unsettled me most wasn't the money. It was a spreadsheet Marisol found buried inside a shared cloud folder Grace had accidentally left accessible from an old work laptop she'd once borrowed from me and never fully logged out of. The spreadsheet was titled Post-Wedding Structure, and it projected Bennett & Co.'s ownership after the ceremony, with Grace listed as majority controller Marcus as a future silent investor, and my name under a column labeled simply released interest. Next to my name in a separate note field, Grace had typed, "Will sign once invitation is on the line." She hadn't hoped I would eventually give up my stake. She had built a financial plan around the assumption that I would calculate it down to a column in a spreadsheet because my desire to be part of this family had always been an asset she could count on. I sat with that sentence longer than I sat with anything else in this whole ordeal. It's one thing to be hurt by someone. It's another thing entirely to discover you were never a person to them at all, just a line item they were confident would resolve itself in their favor. Marisol and I spent the better part of 2 weeks assembling what I started calling, only half-jokingly, the file. Not a scrapbook of grievances, an actual organized case built the way I would build one for a client at the firm who suspected a business partner of fraud. We requested full bank statements going back 18 months. We cross-referenced every transfer against Bloom & Co.'s public client list, which Grace had proudly displayed on her company website, complete with the accounting firm clients I'd originally introduced her to years earlier. We pulled the property records for Bennett & Co. and confirmed in writing that my grandmother's original trust clause requiring dual sign-off on any loan or transfer was still legally binding, which meant the $38,000 loan wasn't just unethical. It was structurally invalid from the moment it was signed. I also went back to the shoebox in my closet and had the photograph from Tyler professionally scanned and enhanced by a forensic imaging service Marisol's firm used for evidence work. The timestamp in the corner of the frame was still legible: 9:43 p.m., October 14th, 12 years earlier, 17 minutes before the first smoke alarm. I want to be honest with you about something. Once I had all of this laid out on Marisol's dining table, bank records, the loan file, the spreadsheet, the photograph, I had a moment where I almost stopped. Not because I doubted any of it, because for the first time in 12 years, I was holding proof that could clear my name completely, and some small tired part of me wondered if clearing my name even mattered anymore, or if I was just about to trade one kind of exhaustion for another. Marisol didn't try to talk me out of that feeling. She just asked one more question. "If you don't use this now, when do you think you will?" I didn't have an answer, so I kept working. The next thing I found was the hardest one to sit with. Buried in an old group text thread from 2 years earlier, a thread I'd muted and forgotten about between Grace, our mother, and a family friend who did event planning on the side, was a message Grace had sent late one night, clearly after a few glasses of wine at some industry conference. She wrote that once I signed away my stake, quote, the loan becomes basically invisible. And that Marcus, quote, doesn't need to know where any of the venue money came from because I'll have it covered before he ever checks a bank statement. Then a few messages later, she'll be furious for like a month. Then she'll fix it. She always does. I read that message probably a dozen times. The first few times I felt something sharp and satisfying, the feeling of being proven right. By the 12th read, that feeling had faded into something closer to grief because she wasn't wrong. I had always fixed it. I fixed the car, the rent, the resume, the introductions, the quarterly books nobody else wanted to review. I had built my entire role in this family around being the person who absorbs consequences quietly. And Grace had simply learned to plan around that fact the way you'd plan around a reliable weather pattern. That became the real center of what I decided to build next, not a plan to embarrass her, but a record. I didn't want the wedding presentation to be a highlight reel of old grievances. I wanted it to show a clear adult chain of decisions. The forged signature, the diverted funds, the spreadsheet planning my erasure, and underneath all of it, the 12-year-old lie about who really started the fire that reshaped both our lives. Marisol and I built a short video just under 10 minutes, using only material that could be independently verified. No dramatic music, no insults. Each slide showed a date, a document, a source. The final slide read simply, "A wedding cannot manufacture trust where deception was used to secure consent." I also prepared 3 sealed folders. One for Marcus containing the full transaction trail connected to Doyle Medical Consulting, and a note recommending he speak with independent counsel before combining any finances. One for my parents containing Marisol's formal preservation notice, and a copy of the fire marshal's original report alongside the enhanced photograph, and one for Grace, containing a copy of the 4 conditions, my 4-word refusal, and a formal request that she repay the diverted funds and relinquish any further control over Bennett and Company's ownership structure. On top of Grace's folder, I wrote one line by hand. You asked me to apologize publicly. This is the public record instead. Marisol read that note and told me it was cold. I told her cold felt safer than cruel, and that I wasn't inventing any consequence that wasn't already true. I was only removing the privacy that had let those consequences sit unpaid for 12 years. Once the box was packed and shipped, addressed to the wedding planner, with clear instructions that it be delivered to the head table, exactly as scheduled, the calls started almost immediately. My father called first at 8:50 in the morning, skipping any greeting entirely. "What did you send the bank?" he demanded, which told me Patricia Reyes's office had already flagged the fraud dispute internally. "The truth," I said. He warned me that vendors, the venue, and Marcus's family could all be hurt by what I was doing. I asked him why my name being forged onto a loan document had been an acceptable risk for 12 months, but my telling the bank the truth about it was suddenly the reckless part. He said, "This is bigger than one signature, Claire." That sentence told me more than he meant it to. I asked whether he'd known about the loan before I found it. There was a long pause. I counted almost 5 full seconds before he admitted that my mother had only sent the license because Grace said the paperwork was temporary. "You let her use my identity," I said. "Sometimes parents make difficult choices to hold a family together," he answered. I told him a family held together by someone else's forged signature was already broken whether or not anyone said so out loud. He offered a deal after that. Sign the release, skip the public apology if I needed to attend quietly, and he'd personally see to it that Grace repaid me over 5 years. I asked what would actually secure those payments, given that nothing had secured anything so far. He said, "Trust." I told him trust wasn't a line item, and I ended the call. My mother tried a softer approach a few hours later. She sent old photographs of Grace and me as children matching dresses at some cousin's christening, and wrote underneath them that whatever I did next would define our family's story forever. I almost answered that message. Instead, I forwarded it to Marisol and turned my phone to silent. Grace called that evening from a number I didn't recognize. Her first words were, "Do you have any idea what you're about to destroy?" She told me the loan was nearly repaid, that Marcus would be humiliated in front of his entire family, that our parents could lose the business they'd spent 12 years rebuilding. Then her voice softened in a way I recognized from childhood, the tone she used whenever she wanted something. She said she wanted me there at the wedding standing beside her, and that sisters shouldn't let paperwork ruin a once-in-a-lifetime day. I asked her to answer one question plainly. Had she signed my name on that loan? There was a pause, and then she said, "I did what the family needed." I had her on speaker. Marisol, sitting across the table, heard every word. Grace kept going. "You always land on your feet, Claire. I needed one thing in my life to actually be mine." There it was finally spoken out loud instead of buried in a spreadsheet. Not remorse, entitlement dressed up as pain. I told her the box was already in transit. She shouted my name, then demanded to know what was inside it. I said, "Everything you were counting on me to keep private, including October 14th. She went quiet in a way that told me she understood exactly what I meant, and for the first time in this entire conversation, she didn't have a rehearsed answer ready. After I hung up, my hands were shaking badly enough that I knocked over a glass of water on Marisol's table. She didn't say anything congratulatory. She just got a towel and helped me clean it up the way you help someone after something's over, not after something's won.